The night over the Saudi-Kuwaiti border in late January 1991 was supposed to belong to Iraqi armor. For the senior commanders in Baghdad, the logic was straightforward and deeply rooted in decades of Soviet doctrine. If political pressure was to be applied to the coalition, it would come through steel tracks, massed formations, and the threat of a grinding ground battle that Western publics were presumed unwilling to endure. Iraqi armored brigades, equipped with T-55 and T-62 tanks and supported by mechanized infantry, were ordered south with a clear objective: cross the border, seize key terrain, and force the United States into a fight on terms familiar to 20th-century land warfare. From the Iraqi perspective, the conditions appeared favorable. Coalition air power had inflicted damage, but it had not erased Iraq's armored force. The terrain was open desert, seemingly ideal for tanks designed to fight across broad European plains. Intelligence assessments suggested that the sector was held primarily by U.S. Marine units classified as light, a word that carried enormous doctrinal significance. Light forces, in Iraqi planning assumptions, lacked the protection and firepower to halt a determined armored thrust. They were expected to delay, withdraw, or collapse under sustained pressure. What Iraqi generals did not understand was that the classification light no longer meant what it once had. By 1991, the United States Marine Corps had spent over a decade reshaping its approach to mechanized combat. The lessons of Vietnam, combined with Cold War planning for a numerically superior adversary, produced a force that emphasized sensors, night fighting, decentralized command, and combined arms integration at the lowest levels. Marines at the tactical edge were trained not merely to survive contact, but to shape it, even against heavier opponents. Crucially, the battlefield itself had changed. Thermal imaging, secure digital communications, and precision-guided anti-armor weapons had eroded the traditional advantages of mass tank formations. Detection no longer depended on daylight or visual contact. Engagements were being decided at ranges and tempos that older armor doctrines were poorly equipped to address. For Iraqi crews trained to fight other tanks head-on, the absence of visible enemy armor created dangerous ambiguity rather than reassurance. As armored columns rolled forward, the expected confrontation failed to materialize. There were no opposing tank silhouettes on the horizon, no thunder of large-caliber guns answering theirs. Instead, Iraqi units encountered something far more disorienting: accurate fire without identifiable sources, vehicles that struck and displaced before a response could be organized, and command networks strained by contradictory reports. What began as confidence quickly gave way to uncertainty. This was not yet defeat, but it was the beginning of doctrinal shock. Iraqi generals were discovering that the battlefield they had entered no longer rewarded weight alone. The American Marines in their path were not defending space in the traditional sense. They were contesting perception, tempo, and decision-making itself, setting the conditions for an outcome that few armored officers in the region had believed possible. The Iraqi High Command attempted to interpret the first reports through familiar frameworks. Tanks were being hit, vehicles disabled, formations disrupted, but the enemy remained undefined. In conventional armored warfare, contact meant contact with mass. A battalion engaged a battalion, armor answered armor, and the side that concentrated fire and momentum prevailed. What Iraqi commanders were receiving instead were fragments. Crews reporting rapid cannon fire without the signature of a main gun, anti-armor strikes arriving from beyond expected engagement distances, and attackers that seemed to move laterally across the desert faster than turret traverse allowed. This confusion was not simply tactical. It reflected a deeper mismatch between doctrine and reality. Iraqi armored formations operated within a rigid command hierarchy. Engagement decisions flowed upward, requests for fires moved through layers of approval, and initiative at lower levels was constrained by doctrine designed for predictability and mass coordination. When the battle unfolded faster than that decision cycle, Iraqi units began reacting to events that had already changed. On the American side, Marine commanders at company and platoon level were operating under a fundamentally different philosophy. Their light armored reconnaissance units were designed for mobility, screening, and information dominance rather than positional defense. Equipped with wheeled armored vehicles mounting medium-caliber cannons and integrated anti-tank missiles, these units were not intended to duel tanks head-on. Instead, They exploited speed, standoff range, and coordination with indirect fires and aviation to dislocate heavier forces. Night was the decisive equalizer. Iraqi armor doctrine relied on daylight optics and limited infrared systems that drastically reduced effective range after sunset. Marine units, by contrast, trained extensively for night operations, using thermal sights that collapsed darkness into usable terrain. Targets were identified not by silhouette, but by heat, movement, and electronic signature. The result was a one-sided detection problem. Marines could see Iraqi formations assembling and advancing long before Iraqi crews understood they were under observation. Once contact occurred, Marine tactics emphasized disruption over destruction. Vehicles engaged briefly, fired accurately, and displaced immediately. Anti-tank missiles were used selectively, prioritized against command vehicles or led elements to fracture formations. Medium-caliber cannon fire targeted optics, external equipment, and lightly armored vehicles, degrading the Iraqi forces' ability to see, communicate, and maneuver. Even when tanks were not catastrophically destroyed, their combat effectiveness dropped sharply. For Iraqi generals monitoring the situation, the engagement defied expectations. Losses were occurring without decisive battles, and momentum was bleeding away in increments that did not align with traditional indicators of defeat. The Americans were not defending a line. They were eroding coherence. By the time Iraqi commanders began to appreciate this shift, their armored units were already operating under conditions of uncertainty, fragmentation, and psychological strain that no amount of numerical strength could easily reverse. As the engagement deepened, the operational consequences of that erosion became increasingly visible. Iraqi armored columns were still moving forward on maps, but in reality they were slowing, compressing, and losing synchronization. Vehicles bunched together as crews sought the perceived safety of proximity, unintentionally presenting denser targets. Commanders attempted to reassert control through radio orders, only to find communications intermittent or overwhelmed by overlapping traffic. Reports from the front contradicted one another, creating a distorted picture of the battlefield at precisely the moment clarity was most needed. This environment favored a force designed to exploit tempo rather than hold ground. Marine units operated as semi-independent nodes, connected by communications and shared situational awareness rather than rigid formations. Individual vehicle commanders were authorized to maneuver aggressively, change engagement geometry, and call for supporting fires without waiting for higher approval. This decentralization was not improvisation. It was deliberate doctrine, developed to compress decision cycles and maintain initiative against larger opponents. A critical factor was the Marines' integration with supporting arms. Light armored units were not acting alone but as part of a layered system. Artillery, attack helicopters, and fixed-wing aircraft were tied into the same command and control network, allowing sensors on the ground to cue fires from multiple domains. An Iraqi tank platoon that halted to regroup could find itself illuminated by targeting data within minutes, sometimes seconds, without ever identifying the source of its exposure. The psychological dimension intensified rapidly. Iraqi crews were trained to expect enemy armor when engaging Western forces. The absence of visible tanks led to a corrosive sense of vulnerability. Tanks are designed to absorb punishment when they can fight back, but being struck without a clear target erodes confidence faster than physical damage alone. Reports from Iraqi units indicated increasing hesitation to maneuver, longer pauses before advancing, and a growing tendency to stop and wait for orders that never arrived in time. Terrain that should have offered advantage instead magnified Iraqi difficulties. The open desert allowed Marine units to exploit speed and distance, choosing angles of engagement that minimized risk. When Iraqi formations attempted to seek cover in urban areas or folds in the ground, they discovered that concealment against human eyesight did not equate to concealment against thermal sensors. Positions that felt secure became liabilities once their heat signatures fixed them in space. By this stage, the armored thrust had lost its operational coherence. The force still possessed tanks, guns, and personnel, but it no longer functioned as an integrated instrument of maneuver. Each movement carried disproportionate risk, and each pause ceded initiative back to the Marines. Iraqi generals were no longer weighing options for exploitation. They were struggling to prevent cascading failure. What had begun as a calculated armored advance was transforming into a battle of attrition on unfavorable terms, shaped not by the destruction of every vehicle but by the systematic breakdown of the Iraqi ability to see, decide, and act in sequence. By the second night of fighting, the consequences of that breakdown were impossible to conceal at higher headquarters. Iraqi generals faced a paradox that their planning models could not resolve. On paper, their armored divisions remained largely intact. Ammunition stocks were still available, fuel had not yet been exhausted, and numerical superiority had not vanished. Yet, operational freedom had disappeared. Units advanced cautiously or not at all, constrained less by enemy firepower than by uncertainty about where the enemy was, how it was fighting, and how quickly the situation could deteriorate. At the core of this paralysis was a fundamental shift in how combat power was being applied. Iraqi doctrine emphasized decisive engagement, the moment when opposing forces met and settled the contest through concentrated violence. The Marines, by contrast, were avoiding that moment entirely. They were not trying to win a single climactic battle. Instead, they were fragmenting the Iraqi force into smaller, increasingly isolated elements that could be shaped, delayed, and neutralized over time. This approach relied heavily on information superiority. Marine units continuously updated their picture of the battlefield through sensors, scouts, and communications that flowed horizontally rather than vertically. A change detected by one vehicle or team rapidly propagated across the network, allowing multiple units to reposition before Iraqi commanders even understood that contact had occurred. The battlefield became fluid in one direction and rigid in the other. Iraqi attempts to restore momentum only reinforced the imbalance. Orders to press forward exposed units that had paused to reorganization to renewed harassment. Efforts to consolidate for protection reduced maneuver space and made formations more predictable. Artillery support, when requested, struggled to achieve effect against a force that rarely remained static long enough to be targeted. Without air support, constrained by coalition air dominance, Iraqi armored units had no means to suppress or displace the Marines at range. Inside Iraqi vehicles, the human cost mounted. Crews operated for extended periods under constant threat without the release of decisive engagement. Fatigue set in, compounded by the stress of fighting at night against an unseen opponent. Tanks are designed to project dominance, but in this environment they became liabilities, large, heat-emitting platforms that drew attention without guaranteeing protection. Some crews began abandoning vehicles not because they were destroyed, but because remaining inside felt more dangerous than escape. For Iraqi generals, this was the moment when strategic assumptions collapsed. The expectation that Western forces would avoid close or sustained ground combat proved false, but so did the belief that such combat would resemble earlier wars. The Marines were present, aggressive, and lethal, yet they refused to fight in a way that could be countered through familiar measures. Every attempt to force a traditional engagement only fed the cycle of disruption. What remained was a realization as unsettling as any battlefield loss. The armored invasion was not being stopped by heavier firepower, but by a system designed to make that firepower increasingly irrelevant. Doctrine, technology, and command philosophy had converged to neutralize mass without directly confronting it, leaving Iraqi leadership grappling with a form of defeat that did not announce itself in a single moment, but unfolded steadily, decision by decision. As daylight returned, it revealed the extent of the imbalance more clearly than night ever could. Scattered across the approach routes were damaged and abandoned vehicles, many of them not destroyed outright but rendered unusable. The pattern was telling. Optics shattered, communications gear damaged, mobility systems compromised. These were not random results. They reflected a deliberate emphasis on disabling the Iraqi forces' ability to function as a coherent formation rather than annihilating it vehicle by vehicle. For commanders trained to measure success by the number of tanks remaining on the field, the reality was deeply unsettling. This method of fighting exploited vulnerabilities that mass alone could not correct. Iraqi tanks were formidable from the front, designed to survive direct engagements with peer armor. But their effectiveness depended on visibility, coordination, and the assumption that the enemy would present itself within predictable envelopes of engagement. Marine units understood that penetrating frontal armor was neither necessary nor efficient. By targeting sensors, flanks, logistics vehicles, and command elements, they attacked the connective tissue of the armored force. The technological mismatch extended beyond weapons. Marine communications allowed small units to share targeting information rapidly, creating a shared understanding of the battlespace that outpaced Iraqi command processes. Engagement ranges were dictated not by gun caliber alone, but by who could see first and act fastest. Anti-armor missiles extended marine reach well beyond the effective night-fighting range of Iraqi tank guns, while medium-caliber cannons filled the gap inside minimum safe distances where larger weapons struggled to respond. Iraqi countermeasures proved inadequate. Attempts to mask movement or reduce signatures were undermined by the heat and mechanical reality of armored vehicles operating in desert conditions. Dispersion reduced vulnerability to some attacks but increased isolation and delayed response times. Concentration restored mutual support but created more lucrative targets for a force adept at exploiting predictability. Each choice carried costs that accumulated faster than Iraqi command structures could absorb. The broader implication became impossible to ignore. This was not simply a local tactical setback. It was evidence that the balance between offense and defense in armored warfare had shifted. Mobility, information, and integration across domains were proving more decisive than armor thickness or gun size alone. The Marines were not outmatching Iraqi units through brute strength. They were outpacing them cognitively and operationally. For Iraqi generals, the realization came too late to reverse the situation. The armored thrust had lost its strategic purpose. It no longer threatened a decisive political or military outcome. Instead, it consumed resources and attention while exposing the force to continued degradation. The option to disengage carried its own risks under constant observation, but remaining in place promised only further erosion. By this stage, the invasion had effectively stalled. Not because the armored force had been wiped out, but because it could no longer impose its will. The Marines had achieved something rarer than battlefield destruction. They had denied the enemy the ability to act with confidence or coherence. In modern warfare, that denial can be as decisive as annihilation, and often far more enduring. By the time Iraqi commanders accepted that the armored thrust had failed, the larger meaning of the encounter was already taking shape. This was not a story of tanks being defeated by luck or isolated heroism. It was a demonstration that the character of land warfare had shifted decisively. Heavy armor was no longer the unquestioned arbiter of ground combat. Its effectiveness now depended on how well it was integrated into a broader system of sensors, communications, fires, and decentralized decision-making. Without that system, even large armored formations could be slowed, disoriented, and rendered strategically ineffective by forces that appeared, on paper, far lighter. For the United States Marine Corps, the engagement validated years of doctrinal evolution. The emphasis on night fighting, combined arms at the lowest levels, and rapid decision cycles had proven its value under combat conditions. Light armored units were not replacements for tanks, nor were they intended to be. Instead, they functioned as enablers, shaping the battlefield so that heavier forces, if committed later, would do so against a degraded and disorganized enemy. In this case, that shaping alone was sufficient to stop an invasion. For Iraqi generals, the lesson was far harsher. Their forces had not lacked courage or numbers. They lacked adaptability. The assumptions that governed their planning belonged to an earlier era, one in which mass and firepower could compensate for slower perception and rigid control. Against an opponent that could see first, move faster, and decide independently, those assumptions became liabilities. The invasion failed not at a single breaking point, but through a steady accumulation of lost options. In the years that followed, militaries around the world studied encounters like this one closely. The conclusions reshaped procurement, training, and doctrine far beyond the Middle East. Armored warfare did not disappear, but it was transformed, subordinated to information and integration in ways that would define conflicts to come. If you want to understand how these quiet doctrinal shifts continue to shape modern battlefields today, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next briefing.